Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. Tonight, we're stepping away from the daily headlines and asking a much larger question, one that may ultimately define not just this decade, but the rest of the 21st century. What if the world isn't simply experiencing a series of unrelated crises? What if war, political violence, economic instability, surveillance, social distrust, and geopolitical upheaval are not temporary disruptions at all? What if they are becoming the permanent operating conditions of our modern civilization? Over the next several minutes, we're going to examine the evidence. We'll explore the growing instability in the Middle East, the return of the political violence, the expansion of surveillance technologies, the collapse of institutional trust, economic uncertainty, and the historical parallels that suggest we may be entering an entirely new era of human history, an era where crisis itself becomes a new normal. This is the age of permanent emergency. For nearly 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, much of the Western world operated under a fundamental assumption that history, in some sense, had been settled. The Cold War had ended, liberal democracy had prevailed, globalization was expanding, technology promised prosperity, international institutions appeared stable. Continued. Many believed that large-scale geopolitical confrontation was becoming less likely and that humanity was entering an age of increasing peace and cooperation. Today, that world no longer exists, and instead, we find ourselves living through a period characterized by constant instability. The war in Ukraine fundamentally altered European security calculations. The rising tensions between the United States and China continue to reshape the Indo-Pacific region. Conflict throughout the Middle East repeatedly threatens to expand into broader regional wars. Our cyber attacks have become routine instruments of statecraft. Economic sanctions have become geopolitical weapons. Information itself has become a battlefield. Unlike the 20th century, where wars often had formal beginnings and formal endings, the conflicts of the 21st century rarely conclude. They evolve. A ceasefire becomes a proxy war, and a proxy war becomes an economic conflict. An economic conflict becomes a cyber conflict, and a cyber conflict becomes a permanent state of strategic competition. The traditional distinctions between war and peace is beginning to disappear. Increasingly, nations find themselves existing in a gray zone, never fully at war, but never entirely at peace either. Perhaps nowhere illustrates this phenomenon more clearly than the modern Middle East. For decades, the region has experienced cycles of conflict involving nation states, proxy organizations, insurgencies, terrorist groups, and international powers. Yet in recent years, these conflicts have become increasingly interconnected. The tensions involving Iran, Israel, the United States, and regional militias, maritime security in the Strait of Hormuz, and energy markets and proxy networks, all operating throughout Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, have demonstrated a critical reality. Modern conflicts do not necessarily end. Instead, they enter periods of escalation and de-escalation. Military operations pause and diplomatic negotiations begin. Economic sanctions continue and cyber operations expand and proxy forces remain active. This creates a permanent state of uncertainty. Markets react and the governments react. Military alliances also react, as well as the populations. This crisis itself becomes self-sustaining. And this phenomenon extends far beyond the Middle East and across Europe, Asia, Africa, and even within domestic politics. We increasingly observe societies operating under a constant expectation of crisis. The emergencies never truly ends. It simply changes shape. 1 month of the crisis is a military conflict. The next month it is an economic crisis. Then it becomes a political crisis, a migration crisis, a public health crisis, a cybersecurity crisis, or a social crisis. Modern societies increasingly exist in state of continuous adaptation to uncertainty. At the same time, political violence has returned to democratic societies in ways many believed were confined to history books. For much of the modern era, the citizens of Western democracies assumed the political assassinations extremist violence, and political terrorism were problems of other nations or other historical periods. That assumption has become increasingly difficult to maintain around the world. Democratic societies have witnessed rising political polarization, assassination attempts, ideological violence, riots, acts of terrorism, and growing extremism. Political violence rarely emerges spontaneously. It develops through a combination of declining trust and increasing polarization, economic anxiety, social fragmentation, ideological radicalization, and the belief that traditional institutions no longer function effectively. History demonstrates that when populations lose faith in the peaceful mechanisms for resolving conflict, some individuals inevitably begin seeking alternative methods. The consequences extend far beyond the immediate victims. Political violence transforms society psychologically. It also creates fear and it creates suspicion. It creates demands for greater security, and throughout history, those demands have often resulted in the expansion of government authority. Our citizens trade liberty for security, believing that the exchange to be temporary, only to discover that emergency powers and emergency institutions have a tendency to become permanent. Perhaps the most profound transformation occurring today is one that many citizens barely recognize because it has become so deeply integrated into everyday life. The rise of the surveillance society. Surveillance is no longer confined to intelligence agencies or law enforcement operations. Our modern surveillance exists almost everywhere. Smartphones track our locations, financial transactions create behavioral profiles, and our social media platforms monitor our preferences and interactions. Artificial intelligence systems also analyze our patterns of behavior. Our facial recognition technologies identify the individuals in public spaces, and governments argue that these technologies improve the security and efficiency. There are businesses that argue that they improve convenience and profitability, and both arguments contain elements of truth. Yet history also demonstrates that technologies developed during periods of emergencies rarely disappear once those emergencies end. And throughout the 20th century, wars and crises repeatedly expanded the authority of our governments and institutions. The surveillance capabilities developed during wartime often remained after peace returned. The security measures enacted during emergencies frequently become permanent components of governance. And the critical question facing modern society is therefore not whether surveillance technologies exist, but rather how societies choose to govern their use and preserve the individual liberties while addressing legitimate security concerns. Underlining every major crisis today is another crisis that often receives less attention, but may be more important than all the others combined. Crises of trust. Across much of the world, trust in our institutions has declined dramatically. Trust in governments has fallen. Trust in media organizations has declined. The trust in corporations, universities, financial institutions, public health authorities, and political systems has weakened. And perhaps most significantly, trust in one another has deteriorated. Without trust, democratic societies become increasingly difficult to govern. Every decision becomes suspect. Every institution becomes questioned. Every event becomes interrupted through competing narratives and ideological frameworks. Our social cohesion begins to fracture, and citizens simultaneously demand a greater protection while increasingly distrusting the institutions responsible for providing it. And this, while it creates dangerous feedback loop. The more instability produces more distrust, and more distrust produces more instability. The political polarization deepens and social divisions will expand. Our public discourse becomes increasingly hostile, and the ability of societies to achieve consensus gradually weakens. In many ways, the crisis of trust may be the defining crisis underlying all others. Our economic uncertainty further intensifies these challenges. Historically, economic insecurity has been one of the strongest predictors of political instability. When the populations feel economically secure, political systems tend to remain relatively stable. When the populations become economically anxious, political behavior changes dramatically. Today, millions of people throughout the developed world face uncertainty regarding inflation, housing, affordability, automation, artificial intelligence, employment security, healthcare costs, government debt, and the future of economic opportunity itself. At the same time, our wealth inequality continues to increase throughout much of the world. This combination produces a population increasingly concerned that the future may be worse than the present. And historically, societies become most unstable not when populations are simply poor, but when the populations believe they are losing control over the future. Anxiety about the future often proves more destabilizing than hardship in the present. History also teaches us and it offers important lessons. While history never repeats itself perfectly, it often rhymes. Before World War I, globalization was accelerating and our technology was transforming society. Economic inequality was growing and political alliances were hardening, nationalism was increasing. But many of the citizens believed that civilization had become too advanced for major war. Then came 1914 and the interwar period, which also provides important warnings. Economic instability and political polarization, institutional collapse and public distrust, and information warfare and ideological radicalization all contributed to one of the darkest periods in modern human history. None of these factors individually caused global catastrophe. Rather, they interacted with one another. This may be the most important lesson history teaches us. Major societal transformations rarely occur because of the one crisis. They occur when multiple crises begin interacting simultaneously. Economic anxiety amplifies the political polarization, and the political polarization increases distrust. Distrust encourages radicalization, and the radicalization increases violence. Violence increases demands for security, and security concerns expand surveillance and government authority. Each crisis reinforces the other. And this brings us to the central question of our discussion tonight. What if the events we are witnessing are not isolated events? What if they are symptoms of a larger transformation? What if humanity is transitioning from an era defined primarily by stability to an era defined by permanent adaptation? A world where governments increasingly govern through emergency measures, a world where surveillance expands in response to insecurity, a world where information itself becomes contested territory, a world where economic anxiety remains persistent, a world where geopolitical competition never fully ends, and a world where societies become permanently mobilized against evolving threats. If this analysis is correct, then the challenge facing humanity is not simply solving individual crises, it's learning how to preserve liberty, democracy, prosperity, and social cohesion within a world of continuous uncertainty. The age of permanent emergency is not necessarily an inevitable destination. History remains shaped by the human choices, but understanding the forces shaping our world is the first step toward confronting them. The rise of geopolitical conflict and political violence, surveillance, institutional distrust, and economic uncertainty should not simply be viewed as isolated headlines appearing on our television screens and social media feeds. They may represent interconnected systems of a broader transformation occurring across the global system itself. The question facing all of us is no longer whether another crisis is coming. The question is whether we are prepared for a world in which crisis itself becomes permanent. And perhaps the most important question of all is this: can free societies preserve their values, their institutions, and their freedoms while living in a perpetual state of emergency? That may ultimately become the defining challenge of the 21st century. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens, If you found this deep dive valuable, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support allows us to continue exploring the stories behind the headlines and asking the difficult questions that define our time. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and as always, peace. We'll see you in the next one.